and thanks to everyone else for being here. I've been waiting 24 years to give this talk, so I'm very excited that we finally came together and were able to make it happen. So it is actually a confluence of a couple different interests of mine. One is a history of writing and Semitics. As you heard, I work in Near Eastern studies, mostly on the ancient side, which is where writing was born, and most of the writing systems in use today developed in one form or another in the ancient Middle East. But also really interested in Jewish studies, which I get to teach as well. And so those meet on this topic. And so I'm excited to share with you some of the findings, information, discoveries, and also some of the questions, open and ambiguous as they may be, that the topic raises. All right, so I'm going to start a little bit with some history on where the alphabet came from, what we know about it. Is obviously going to be a bit sketchy, but some of the major signposts along the way. And then we'll turn to the Jewish sources in the second half and think about the implications for Jewish thought, what Jewish thought said about the alphabet, and where this all leads us. Okay, so alphabet, I should say just something about the terms before we get into it. So writing is a little bit more than 5,000 years old, something like 3,300 BCE or so. That comes from Mesopotamia first, and then Egypt, and then develops in different places around the world, at different points in time. But the alphabet, as far as we know, was invented only once. So the alphabet, by alphabet, I mean a writing system that has a small number of signs, one sign per sound in the language. And for every sound in the language, just one sign. So English spelling is actually a really bad example of an alphabet. We have sounds that don't have signs, like cha, and we have signs that don't actually have sounds, like the letter C. But that's because once you put things out in the real world, things take all sorts of turns, and you never know where they'll wind up. Of course, English is an alphabet. It just happens to be not a perfectly matched alphabet to the English language. But other writing systems like Mesopotamian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs or Chinese used from about at least 1300 BCE down to the modern era are not alphabets at all. So they have all sorts of different signs, many of which don't have anything to do with specific sounds. And it's pretty easy to tell when something is not an alphabet because the number of signs is going to be much higher. So to write in cuneiform, you needed about 500 signs. Hieroglyphs needed about 600 signs. And a typical Chinese book requires somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 signs. An alphabet gets by, in theory, with less than 30 signs. We make it a little bit more complicated. We have uppercase and lowercase. We have punctuation marks, things like that. But about 30 signs should do it for a typical alphabet. So the alphabet is an idea that was invented only once. You see the sort of very sketchy map on the screen. It's definitely invented in the vicinity of Egypt by people who spoke a Semitic language. That's what we can tell just by looking at it. The very, very earliest alphabetic texts. I'm going to show you a little bit more in a second, because some of the signs used are clearly drawn from Egyptian hieroglyphs. They're modeled on what Egyptian hieroglyphs look like, but the words written are Semitic words. So Semitic is a family of languages, which includes Hebrew. So if you have any Hebrew, that'll help here because some of the words in the earliest inscriptions are recognizable from Hebrew. So here there's this little site called Wadi al-Hol, Valley of Terror, down near the Big Bend in the Nile River. That's one place where we have some very early alphabetic inscriptions. These are literally graffiti on the rock face in that valley. And I'll show you a picture. This is what that inscription looks like. And this is the alphabet in the earliest form. We don't actually know where exactly it was invented, so no reason to think it was invented in Wadi al-Hol down in southern Egypt. But this is what the alphabet looks like in its earliest stages. So the signs are what's called pictographic, as they really look like things. Of course, sometimes even looking like things doesn't mean that you would know exactly what they are. This is obviously a person. It's kind of amazing that we all think it's a person because it's obviously a very sketchy person. This is a corner. This top one over here, that's water. So if you think about drawing water, that's water. And that's a good letter to start with for the early alphabet. Water in Hebrew, of course, is mayim. And the first, the first sound of that word is m, that M in English. And so the letter for water was called mem, as the word for water in a dialect slightly different from Hebrew, but very related to Hebrew. And the secret of the alphabet, the whole crux of inventing the alphabet, was to pick something that you could draw where the picture would stand for the first sound of that word. Okay, so the picture would stand for the first sound of that word. So if we're looking at water, this has nothing to do with water anymore. Now it just stands for the M sound. And then once you do that, you come up with a list of words for every sound in your language, and you can then generate a picture for every sound in your language, and then you can write anything. So this thing is a head, so that was a rosh, and so it stands for the R sound, and so on and so forth. We're not going to go through every single one of them. This one's pretty famous, this ox with the horns. In some Semitic languages, including Hebrew, the word for ox was aleph, and so the aleph, which began with a glottal stop, was the picture that meant that glottal stop sound.
Sorry to interrupt, but can you show us, with your cursor, show us which symbol, like, for example, you were just talking about with the ox?
Do you not see it? I'm sorry. I've been pointing with the cursor, but maybe it's
no, there, it's hard to see your cursor because, okay, so can you all see it now? It's down there. It's like on the bottom of the page. It's the bottom of the images and the one to the right there. I see it. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. I'll try to be more deliberate in drawing attention. Okay, so that's the crux of the idea of the alphabet, was to come up with a small number of pictures. Each one would be a concrete object, and each one would stand for the sound at the beginning of the word for that object. And again, once you have that list, in the earliest forms, it's about 27, 28 pictures. You can write anything in that language. This one seems to be that graffiti that we were looking at, seems to be a prayer. So this word is, again, not in Hebrew, but machtar, related to a Hebrew word that I won't go into now, but machtar for a prayer. So someone wrote a graffiti and they just wrote their name and they wrote this was a prayer. They are walking in a place called the Valley of Terror. We don't know exactly what they're terrified of.
So this was writing on a facade of some, like a cave,
literally on the stone face of a valley. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right. So that's probably the most esoteric text we're going to look at today. Now we're going to get into some more regular looking texts. So this is the Sinai Peninsula, of course. Here now we're looking at if you try to orient yourself in the Red Sea or the Gulf of Suez. So here, look at the coast here. And we're going to zoom in a little bit, and you see that there's a sort of landing place. If you're coming from the sea, this would be a good place to land. There's a town there now called Abu Zanima, and from there it's a good place to land because right at the beginning of the Sinai Peninsula there's a giant plateau, but here there's a valley that cuts through it. If you follow that valley, if you're walking, it's going to be a few hours, but if you follow, and I had the chance to do this actually with some Bedouins a few years ago, follow that valley, you wind up at the ruins of an Egyptian temple at a place called Sarabit al-Khadam. It is huge, and this is my picture of it as I approach from sort of over a hill. The reason that we're talking about it now, that's me with one of the goddesses who I had finally gotten to meet, Hecht-Koller, who is the goddess of turquoise, and I was excited to make her acquaintance. But the reason we're talking about this site now is that at that site were found some of the other earliest alphabetic texts. This is probably one of the most famous ones. This one lives now in London in the British Museum. And it's famous, first of all, because it's in London, so they can show it really well, as opposed to the most of them which are in Cairo. Cairo's been reconstructing its museum for the last decade or so. Now the Grand Egyptian Museum is just opening. I don't yet know what they've done with the stuff from Sarabit al-Khadam. But this one, besides being in London, also is bilingual. So it's this little sphinx. It's really small. You think about sphinxes as like these giant things in the sand. This one's really small. It fits in your hand. And on the front right corner, shoulder, you can see, the right shoulder, you see there's hieroglyphic inscription, which in Egyptian says, the beloved of Hecht-Koller. that goddess. Whoops, that goddess over here. And then under it, in the alphabet, we have, can you see my cursor? Because I'm going to trace this. So this mem, an aleph, and then this is a hey, apparently a person, their hands up, and then a house. The house is, of course, in Hebrew, a beit, or bayit. But remember, you're not supposed to think about the words. We're just using them for the first sounds of their words. So that's mem, aleph, hey, bet. So something like, if it were Hebrew, something like mi'uhav or beloved. Beloved, which is what it says in Egyptian as well. The Egyptian word is not mi'uhav because it's written in Egyptian, but it matches it. And then it actually gives the word for goddess, ba'alat. So mi'uhav ba'alat, beloved of the mistress. So this is, sometimes said to be something like the Rosetta Stone of the early alphabet, because it was really only looking at this that scholars there's a particular article from 1916 where a scholar understood what this alphabet was and how it worked.
And there was a question. Do you always read it from right to left, or does it kind of change left to right depending?
This one's left to right. And early on, for the first 700 years or so, we see things left to right, right to left, and even top to bottom. Also, my favorite direction is exactly, Joel's pointing it out, boustrophodon, which literally means as the ox plows, but it means you start on one side and you go to the end and then you come back. So you're going along the field as the ox plows. But it's a great point, and maybe we'll get to talk about it a little bit more, because what it really tells us is that there's no sort of scribal training early on. People are sort of making it up as they know the signs, they know how to write, but no one's told them like this is the proper way of writing. So they're sort of free to modify it as they see fit. So that's sorry, before we move on, I'll just say those are the earliest ones. We have about 40 alphabetic texts from that site, Sirabet al-Khadim. Most of them are really short. They're dedicatory inscriptions, a name here or there. Some of them have a few lines, and we can make out some words, but between the fact that they're not all that well preserved and the fact that we still don't know every single sign what exactly it meant, there's very little that we can say in terms of like sentences from these early inscriptions. But we know that the alphabet existed. Again, it has to be around the area of Egypt, written by people who spoke a Semitic language related to Hebrew. So to put some dates on this, obviously, dates get in the way, but they're also helpful. So 1900-ish is probably the invention of the alphabet, maybe in Sinai, but that's really just a guess. Over the next few hundred years, and I want to emphasize how long this period is, right? Sometimes when we do ancient history, we're like, oh, it just took a century to get over there. But a century is actually a very long time. So over the next few centuries, the alphabet moves, but it moves very little. So we find some alphabetic texts in the land of Israel, some alphabetic texts really short, even in Mesopotamia, some down in Egypt. But if you look just at what you see in front of you, for the first 600-700 years of the history of the alphabet, there's actually very, very little written in the alphabet. We can sort of plot it on the map and say like, oh, it's clearly traveling, but it does not at all take over the world. There is lots of writing in this world. So in Egypt, they're still writing in hieroglyphs and a cursive that we call hieratic. In Mesopotamia, they're still writing in cuneiform. Up in Turkey, they're still writing in cuneiform, different language, but same script. In the land of Israel, what we have from these centuries is mostly in cuneiform also. So even though the alphabet exists, it's not the case that everyone sort of said, wow, what an amazing idea. We've all got to convert to this new alphabet, right? And I think it's useful. I'm not going to belabor this point because we don't have time to go in all the directions that I think are really fascinating to go in with the alphabet. But you have to think about the alphabet as a technology. And most technologies only are successful if there's a market for them. There are rare technologies that create the markets, right? So you think about the printing press, you think about the iPhone, where no one knew that they needed it, but once it existed, suddenly everyone needed it. But most technologies only work to the extent that there is demand. So the alphabet, there just wasn't demand. It could, in principle, open up literacy to many, many more people than could have gone to scribal school and studied for 5 years or 7 years to learn cuneiform. But no one wanted to learn to be literate. This wasn't a big pent-up demand for mass literacy in the world. So even though the alphabet is sort of sitting there, we don't see an explosion of writing anywhere. Just to put some of the other dates there, around 1200 would be the Exodus from Egypt. So by that time, of course, you have the nation of Israel. 200 years after that, we have King David. And there, I'm not sure we'll have time to do this in a lot of detail, but at that point, we actually have some hard evidence for writing, alphabetic writing in Israel from marginal places, which is actually more important. So not huge texts from Jerusalem, but on the contrary, sort of short but interesting texts from the margins. And if there's writings in the margins of society, that tells us that there's probably a lot of writing in the core of society. Some of the other stuff we'll get to later on, the Greek borrowing, and then the rest of it I'll leave out for now. So I said that there was writing in Israel by 1000. This is plausibly the earliest text that we might call Hebrew, but there's really no linguistic reason to call it Hebrew. It's an ostrakhan, which just means it's a broken piece of pottery with writing on it. This comes from a site up in the Galilee called Isizbet Sarta. And as you can see, it's actually really nicely preserved. You see these 5 lines of writing. You can see it looks very clear like an alphabet. The first 4 lines, as far as anyone can tell, are entirely gibberish. Make no sense, no words, no sentences, no names, no idea what those are. I've pored over it for a while, can't make heads or tails out of it. But the last line is the alphabet written out. Now, again, whoever asked about the direction, this one's left to right. And if you look at it, you actually see some differences between it and the familiar form of the alphabet. Some of that is just a mistake. So if you look at it, we get Aleph, Gimel, Bet, Dalid, Hey, Vav, Chet, Zayin. So some of it, as soon as you see that, you're like, oh, well, that's not the order that's familiar to me. But actually, is there any significance to the order? So not clear. I don't know that that's a mistake. That might well just be a different order that circulated in some areas. As you get later on in the alphabet, though, you get things like 2 kufs and no resh. That's clearly a mistake, right? That's just a mistake that someone wrote 2 kufs. They wrote the same letter twice down here. You see the head of the kuf with the long line, and then went immediately to the shin without any resh whatsoever. So that's presumably just a mistake. It's hard to imagine that there's an alphabet that had 2 kufs and no resh. But this is about the year 1100. So the period of the judges in biblical history. And all we can really say is that someone's writing with the alphabet in the Galilee about 1100. From the time of King David, around 1000, we have this little ostrakhan from a site in the Shephelah called Khirbet Keyafa. You see, again, 5 lines. You see someone's fingers there. I actually know whose fingers they are, but it doesn't matter now. Holding this little ostrakhan. And here we can actually make a little bit more sense of it. It seems to be sentences. I don't have time to go through all the details, but it seems to be something like an administrative text, mentions a king even, and seems to refer to judging the widow and the orphan. So this is like a real text, not just the letters of the alphabet scribbled, but a proper text with sentences and verbs and nouns and things like that. And again, this is found in the lowlands west of Jerusalem. If a text like this is being found in the lowlands, presumably in Jerusalem itself, there is plenty of writing happening. We have 0. I shouldn't say that. We have 6 letters, literally 6 letters, scratched on the side of a jar from this time in Jerusalem, but we have nothing. Part of that is just the archaeological history of Jerusalem, which Dr. Magnus is maybe said a lot about. But one of the features of the history of Jerusalem is just how often it was destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt. There's also, of course, the modern reality that in many of the areas, especially where there was actually ancient settlement, there will never be archaeological excavations. So the city of David is a very fraught place. Anything north of that, as you get closer to the Temple Mount, is basically off limits. And that's certainly where the earliest settlements were. So we should have no idea what's sitting there, possibly waiting to be uncovered, were it to be dug up. But as of now, we basically have nothing from Jerusalem from this time. But I also, before we move on, just want to point out that this doesn't look anything like what we think of as Hebrew writing, right? And that's an important point to make. So this is what Hebrew, this is clearly the Hebrew language in the kingdom of Judah in the time of King David. This is as Jewish as you can possibly get in biblical times, but it doesn't look anything like what is familiar to us as Hebrew writing. So one of the stories that we're going to have to tell in the next 15, 20 minutes or so is how the Hebrew letters came to look like they do to us, the familiar Hebrew letters. Okay, so part of that story begins over here. This is, as you can see, a sarcophagus of, well, you can see it's a sarcophagus, beautifully carved. And actually, it's a Phoenician king's sarcophagus. Guy's name was Achirom. You can see a picture of him actually sitting on his throne here. I don't know whether that's realistic or not, but that's his depiction of him and all the people lined up to present him offerings. But you can see, you can just make out over here. We're not going to look too carefully at it, but you can just make out at the top on the lid an inscription. And this is a Phoenician inscription from the same time as that Astrakhan we just looked at. So this is what's going on up in Phoenicia. They're also writing with the alphabet. You see down here what the Phoenician letters looked like. And Phoenicians played a huge role in the transmission of the alphabet. They're most famous, I think, for transmitting the alphabet to the Greeks. The Phoenicians were the great sea merchants of the Eastern Mediterranean in the Iron Age, and the Greeks get the alphabet from the Phoenicians. That's a part of the story that we're not really going to have time to talk about today. But the Hebrew alphabet also comes through the Phoenicians. And the reason we know that is that the Phoenicians are the ones who reduced the alphabet to just 22 letters. Hebrew never would have done that because Hebrew had more than 22 sounds. One of them actually left its mark. It gets a little technical to explain what exactly the story was, but the oddity of having the shin and the sin being written with the same letter is a relic of the fact that the Israelites borrowed the 22-letter Phoenician alphabet for a language that had more than 22 sounds. So we have the same problem in English, right? We have letters that do double duty, letters that we have a mismatch between signs and sounds. Hebrew in biblical times actually had the same. They had a mismatch between sounds and signs. They had too many sounds, not enough signs. And the reason for that was that they had gotten the alphabet from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians had only 22 sounds and therefore 22 signs. Israelites had more, 23, 24, even 25 sounds. We can reconstruct those from all different sources, but only 22 letters because they had gotten them from the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians turn out to play a really important role in the history of the alphabet. I mentioned that the Greeks get it from the Phoenicians. This is actually one of the earliest Greek inscriptions we have, actually found on an island west of Italy, but written in Greek. And you can see the scratching on the drinking bowl here. And the text itself, translated, of course, says, "Nestor's cup is good to drink from." That's probably actually a reference to a little scene in the Iliad where King Nestor has a giant gold cup. But Nestor's cup is good to drink from, but he who drinks from this cup, immediately desire of fair garlanded Aphrodite will seize him. So maybe it's a little early in California to start thinking about this. So not preaching drinking at 10 a.m., but obviously what they're drinking is wine. And the promise is that this is a really humble clay pot. But if you drink from it, you drink wine, then desire for Aphrodite, who of course is the goddess of sex, will immediately seize you. So this is actually amazing because as soon as the Greeks get the alphabet, this is what they write. Sometimes they get different cultures get writing, and all we have for like centuries are like names scratched into walls and things like that. The Greeks get the alphabet, they immediately start writing poetry about wine and sex on their drinking cups. It's kind of amazing, but we're going to leave the Greeks aside for our purposes today and stick to the Middle East. I actually think I'm gonna, well, okay, maybe I'll say this really quickly. The order of the letters that I alluded to earlier, one of the reasons that is significant, right? When you think about English letters, I don't know how often people even look things up in dictionaries anymore or encyclopedias. Obviously, when you go to an online dictionary encyclopedia, you don't need to know alphabetical order. You just type it in and it finds whatever you wanted. So, I think when people have to remember the order, like, is P before or after Q, like sometimes people actually wind up reciting the alphabet to get there. The order actually doesn't matter for most purposes, right? Once you learn how to write, you don't care what order these letters are in. One of the reasons that the Hebrew letter order does matter is for what eventually gets called gematria, right, which is obviously a Greek term borrowed in, but the numerical value of the letters. And it's an open question, debated question, I should say, how old gematria is as a technique. It's hard to know really when, in biblical times, was anyone using the letters not just as numbers, but to like count as significant. There's a couple of hints that maybe they were, and I'm just going to throw one at you really, really quickly. This was discovered, or at least hypothesized, by a colleague at Hebrew University named Israel Knoll. And he pointed out that in two poems in the Hebrew Bible, one in Exodus, this is the Song of the Sea, and one in Deuteronomy, Song of Moses, I'll show you in a second, they both begin with a few lines which have, if you count up, I don't know if anyone's been counting as I've been talking, count up 26 words exactly, 26 words. And they end with a reference to the name of God, which is written out here, Yud, He, Vav, He. In gematria, the numerical value, Yud is 10, He is 5, Vav is 6. So Yud, He, Vav, He is 26. So the poem begins with 26 words, culminating in the phrase, Yud, He, Vav, He is his name. If that happened once, it would be intriguing. So this is the Exodus 15, but it happens again in Deuteronomy 32, and again, 26 words culminating in the name of God, Shem Adonai, Shem Hashem. So Knoll's like, that seems like beyond coincidence, and it means not only is there a technique being used here, but also it means that they're thinking about the numerical value of the name of God, that Yud, He, Vav, He equals 26, and therefore construct the poem to have 26 words in those first few lines. So you can't prove it beyond that. I just gave you all the data that there is on this. The question really is this beyond coincidence or not? That's kind of the question. If it's not beyond coincidence, then that establishes that they were, if it is beyond coincidence, I'm sorry, that they were thinking about the numerical value of the name of God. But it's enigmatic and really intriguing question. All right, I'm not going to say anything about this. If any of you have been to the city of David and what's called Hezekiahs Tunnel, this was inscription found in it. So this is from about the year 700. This is what Hebrew looks like in about the year 700. That's the time of the prophet Isaiah, about 100-something years before the destruction of the first temple. And if we sort of take stock, we can see how the letters have changed, right? So I told you that they're inspired by hieroglyphs in this column. This is the early forms, what people sometimes call the Proto-Canaanite. I happen to hate that term, but Proto-Canaanite alphabet. And then in that inscription, this is what the Hebrew letters look like in that inscription from the city of David. But 800 years later, we're going to find something very different. We're going to find recognizable Hebrew letters. How do we get to that? I'm going to skip all this. And the answer is the destruction of the temple and the Babylonian exile. So what you're looking at now is a fragment of a Dead Sea Scroll. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are, of course, much later, from Roman times, basically, late Hellenistic into Roman times. But when the Jews went into exile in Babylonia, they came under the dominion of great empires. And that dominion essentially never ended. There was a brief interregnum with the Hasmoneans, but they were ruled first by the Babylonians. The Babylonian Empire crumbled and was supplanted by the Persians. The Persian Empire lasted all the way until the coming of Alexander the Great. And after Alexander, it's divided up, and the Ptolemies down in Egypt and the Seleucids up in Syria alternate ruling the land of Israel. So Jews are never independent from the destruction of the first temple all the way till the Hasmonean rebellion in 164. That only lasts a century, right? I mean, a century, again, a century is a long time. I shouldn't say only, I just said a century is a long time. But until 63 BC, when the Romans take over. So there's that 1 century of Jewish independence from 164 to 63. Otherwise, the Jews are parts of big cosmopolitan empires. No one ever forced the Jews to change the ways that they write. Really, no one cared. Anyone could write exactly how they wanted to write. You even have a reference to that in the book of Esther, when decrees go out to the 127 provinces, to every nation in its language and to every province in its script, right? So it's really pluralistic in terms of how you write. Like they really don't care. But Jews seem to have cared. They wanted to be part of the big Persian Empire. They wanted to fit in with the bureaucracy. It was necessary for courts, but more broadly, that's what scribal training looked like in the Persian Empire. So over the course of a couple of centuries, Jews sort of abandon, for the most part, although we'll see not entirely, what we would call the Old Hebrew script, the native Hebrew script, and pick up what scholars call the Aramaic script. Aramaic, of course, is a language rather than a script, but it was the language and the script being used in the Persian Empire more broadly. So it was being used by scribes to write Aramaic everywhere, from Egypt all the way to Uzbekistan and throughout the whole Middle East. And Jews picked up that scribal training and began writing Hebrew language in what we call the Aramaic script. So by the time you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls are about 900 texts. About 10 of them are written in the Old Hebrew script. The rest of them are written in recognizably Hebrew script, or what we call Hebrew script, but what we should properly call something like the Aramaic script, or the Aramaic script adopted by the Jews. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we do see some relics, though. I think you can, if you read Hebrew at all, I think this is actually really easy to pick out. Right, so this is a Dead Sea Scroll called Pesher Chabakuk. Doesn't matter, we're not really reading it, but most of it is sort of regular square Hebrew script. But then here, you see these 4 letters. This is the name of God written in clearly a different script. So anyone who's reading Hebrew, that like jumps out on the page. And in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they write the name of God in particular in the Old Hebrew script. So they still know it, they're still acquainted with it, and they use it only for really sacred things. Hard to know why exactly. Maybe I'll leave that as an open question. I have a couple of theories, but I'll leave it for you to ponder. Down in the Talmud, and I'm going to move now to the last part of the talk. Down in the Talmud, the rabbis of the Talmud are well aware of the fact that the script has changed over the centuries. So they don't think that the script that they are using is the primordial Jewish script. And we have a couple of passages, a couple of discussions in different texts, but here's one from the Babylonian Talmud, which manages to combine some real history and also some interreligious polemics into a short little compact passage. So an Amorah, a later rabbinic sage, Mar Zutra, some say Mar Ukva, is quoted as saying, at first the Torah was given to Israel in Hebrew script and Hebrew language, right? So the old Hebrew script and the Hebrew language. It was given to them again in the days of Ezra in Assyrian script and Aramaic language. So Ezra, of course, is one of the great Jewish leaders who leads Jews from the Babylonian exile back to Jerusalem in the middle of the 5th century. So that's pretty good history, actually. Like around the 5th century BCE is when we start to see Jews switching from what we call the Old Hebrew script to the Aramaic script. But it also says that the Torah was given in Aramaic language. Israel chose for herself the Assyrian script, right, so the later script, and the Hebrew language, which is a pretty good characterization of the Torah as we have it. It's in a later script, but in ancient biblical Hebrew, and left the Hebrew script and the Aramaic language, Hebrew script, the old script, and the Aramaic language for the simpletons. Now, who are the simpletons? The Talmud goes on to say, who are the simpletons? The Samaritans. What you see in front of you is literally a picture of a contemporary printing of a Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans, which of course are a group who deserve a lecture unto themselves, still existing. I would say going strong, but not really going strong, but still existing at least. Their script in both Hebrew and Aramaic language has always been written in a descendant of the Old Hebrew script. So this is not exactly the way the Old Hebrew script looked like 2,500 years ago, of course, but it is clearly a descendant of that. They never made the move to switch script to the Aramaic script. So the Talmud, uses this as a polemic, like the simpletons still use the old Hebrew script. We've adopted the new, modern, sophisticated Aramaic script. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'll have to leave it aside for now. The last point I want to make is that despite this history, despite knowing that the Hebrew script was the Hebrew script that is now known, or known even to the rabbis, is not the form that the Torah originally took. The rabbis are also very happy to import mystical meaning to those letters. So sometimes that's just in generalities, like the text you have in front of you here. This is from the, again, Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav, Bitzalel, the architect of the tabernacle, knew how to combine the letters with which the heaven and earth were created. So that's a general statement that the letters are the foundational building blocks of the heavens and earth. That gets developed to a great degree in mystical texts. The date of the text of Sefer Yetzirah is not known. Might even be contemporaneous, maybe even earlier than the Babylonian Talmud. But it begins with, there are 22 letters and 10 pathways, and then develops those as the building blocks of the world. I don't have time to talk more about that system, but it's really a fascinating system. But even in sort of classical rabbinic literature, you get midrashic texts like this one. This is in Genesis Rabbah and Breshit Rabbah. Rabbi Jonah said in the name of Rabbi Levi, why was the world created with the bet? Which, of course, is a reference to the fact that the first letter of the Torah is bet, in the word Bereshit. So you look at a bet as we have it. Why was it created with the bet? To teach that just as the bet is closed on all three sides and open only in the front, and it's going forward, so does one not have the right to inquire about what is above and what is below, but only about time since the day the world was created. So significance to the shape of the bet, right? It sort of closes off above, below, and behind and says, listen, don't ask me about before the Bereshit, just go from Bereshit and onward. Of course, in the old Hebrew script, that midrash doesn't work, right? That's the old Hebrew bet. It's closed. I don't know what you would call this, but it's certainly not going to work for that midrashic comment. There are midrashim about the letter Hey, closed on all its side and open on its bottom, pointing at the people who are going to descend to Sheol. The letter Yud, which is bent over. Again, sort of midrashim that expound on the shape of the letters as significant, but none of them work in the old Hebrew script, right? So there's the way that the Torah would have originally looked. None of these midrashic comments actually work. It's the Hey is not open on the bottom. The Yud is not small and crooked. So what's fascinating is that the rabbis are aware of the fact that the letters that they use are not the original ones, and yet they still impart massive significance to the shape of the letters that they use. They're aware of even, we can show this historically, but I don't have time for it now, other people, besides the Samaritans, still use the old Hebrew script down to Roman times. So alongside, it didn't disappear from Jewish society. It's on Bar Kokhba coins, for example. So it's there in circulation, but the rabbis don't use it at all. And that's actually a fascinating point because the rabbis are aware of this and they make a big deal about it. So in a Mishnah, in a legal text, they actually say if you wrote a Torah scroll, right? If Soferet Taylor writes his Torah scroll in the old Hebrew script, it would not be valid. It would not be acceptable, even though the same rabbi said that's what it used to look like. This is amazing. I think it's actually a fundamental point, really a profound point about sanctity. The rabbis are really careful, in this case, not in every case, not to confuse antiquity with sanctity. Right? Those are not the same thing. Something is sacred not because it's original. They essentially look at the Torah and they say, look, it's not what it used to look like, but this is what it looks like today. And so the Torah is sacred in its current state. I know this isn't what it looked like 1,000 years ago. I know that like the prophet Samuel would not have been able to read this because he had different letters. That doesn't bother me. What was sacred in 1000 BCE is not what's sacred in 300 CE. Sanctity can change, and they don't make the mistake of confusing the way things used to be with the way things need to be. So I think it's actually a profound point that they're making. But before I wrap this up, I do want to make one point that's sort of a rationalist take on sanctity. So as I said, I just don't, we don't have time today to talk about the mystical paths that the alphabet has traveled, but it's certainly traveled lots of mystical paths. Jewish and Christian, I should say. There's a whole literature of Christian Kabbalistic thinking on the Hebrew letters. But even a rationalist might look at Jewish texts and say, you know what, there is actually some sanctity, even some spiritual significance to the Hebrew alphabet. What you have in front of you on the screen are three texts from more or less within a century of each other, but totally different languages, right? So on the right, you have Yiddish. In the middle, you have Judeo-Arabic. That's actually the Maimonides himself. You see his signature on the bottom. We have his handwriting and text from the Cairo Geniza. And on the left, you have Ladino, which is Judeo-Spanish, or Judesmo, as sometimes called. There are more examples I could give you, but these three, I think, do the job of showing you that what they have in common, literally a Yiddish speaker cannot read Judeo-Arabic. A Judeo-Arabic speaker cannot read Ladino, right? They're mutually unintelligible. And yet, as soon as you see it, you know it's a Jewish text, all three of them. Because what all of them did was write their language, right? The Germanic language, the Arabic language, the Spanish language, wrote it in Hebrew script. And that's something that the vast majority of Jewish writing over the course of the last 2,000 years has done, is to use the same script, even when the languages differ fundamentally. That's something that doesn't happen anymore, and I actually worry about it. I worry about it because I think this was something that did bind Jews to each other, no matter what. They literally didn't speak the same language, but they all read Hebrew because they all learned the Hebrew alphabet. So then, you put a Bible in front of them and they can read the Hebrew script because that's what they learned for their own language, for Yiddish or Arabic or Ladino as well. Judeo-English, so to speak, which, as you know, is a real dialect. Maybe you've had Sarah Benor speak, fantastic speaker, and really insightful on the linguistic side of it. But Jewish English is written like English, right? On the contrary, when we write it, we learn to weed out all the Jewish elements of it. There's no Jewish version, written version, I'm sorry, of an English dialect. And that's a departure from the way Jewish languages used to work. And it's also a departure from the focus on the Hebrew script that followed Jews around the world for a couple of thousand years. So it is an aspect of culture that was really central to Jews for a very long time, no matter where they were. The number of Judeo languages is in the dozens, and they all use the Hebrew script to write it. And that's something that we've abandoned. So now the Hebrew script has been associated with one particular language, Hebrew and Yiddish when it's written. But that's something that we've abandoned, and I think it's to our own detriment that we've abandoned it. So if I were to think about the significance of the Hebrew script today, I would push it as a symbol of Jewish identity. It's served that way for the last 1,000 years, no matter where Jews were. And I would love to bring that back, that Jews can write and read the Hebrew script, no matter what language they're reading. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Terrific. So people are sending in questions. Please keep sending your questions. We can get to them in the next 10 minutes or so. I will tell you that when I go to meetings and I want to write notes that no one can understand, and my Hebrew is not quite what it is, I use Hebrew letters to write out my English notes. So, wow. And I did that after Professor Benor's lectures. I was like, yeah, I'll just do it because no one can read my letters, and I know, and I can read the English. So I do that. Right. The other thing I will tell you is that we were in Germany for a CSP adventure, so we learned a lot about Moses Mendelssohn. And I learned that Moses Mendelssohn translated the Bible into German so people can understand it. Have you seen his translation?
Yeah. I have a printed text at home, actually. Yeah.
It's Hebrew letters.
Right.
He wrote the Bible. The translation is actually Hebrew letters, but German words.
Amazing.
So that is the example of what you were just talking about.
Great example. Yeah.
One question was, so when we do read Hebrew, we read it from right to left. So when did it get stuck in? Is that an Aramaic thing that we just picked up, that you read from right to left?
Oh, no, that's a great question. Right. So I said there was a lot of variability at the beginning, and then certainly by 1,000 is key date because we get a lot of writing from about 1,000. So it doesn't actually mean things are new then, but that's when we have a significant amount of data. So by 1,000, it's all the alphabet in the Near East are being written right to left. I should say cuneiform is not. So it's not the case that this was obvious, but Egyptian is. Egyptian script, the cursive called hieratic, is written right to left. So it's likely that was the source of influence. It's hard to know exactly when and where, but if you think about the court in Jerusalem, Solomon is said to have married a daughter of Pharaoh, and that might not be trivial when we think about Hebrew writing. There's a good amount of evidence that Hebrew scribal practices were very deeply influenced by Egyptian scribal practices. I don't want to pin it just on this one Egyptian princess, but the fact that there's a marriage also indicates that there's close ties there. So as there's the first royal court in Israel, there's also close ties with Egypt, and that seems to promote certain aspects of scribal culture that come from Egypt to Israel and to the whole area. So Phoenicia. Also, one of them I think is the direction of writing. That's a great point.
Thank you. There's a good question from Robert. He wants to know what about vowels? So when did they come into?
Oh, yeah. So vowels are a story unto themselves.
Because you can't read. I mean,
exactly right. So I'll suffice with just the following. Obviously, the language always had vowels, right? So if you listen to it, the language always had vowels in it. But there was no way of writing the Hebrew vowels until the early Middle Ages. No system whatsoever. In about the 800s or so, maybe a little bit earlier, but let's take the date 800, give or take a century, Jews for the first time develop systems of writing vowels. And as it turns out, there were three different systems. The one that's familiar to us is the one that's from the city of Tiberias, so called the Tiberian system. But there was a different system in Babylonia. There was a different system in southern Palestine. And they probably did this knowing that the Muslims had just done this for Arabic. So they sort of get the idea that they can actually use a system of dots and dashes to indicate everything needed to read. Right? But it does actually revolutionize it because when you think about reading Hebrew, so those of you who have read Hebrew, when you think about reading Hebrew without vowels, it relies on knowing the language. You can't read the words unless you know what it's supposed to say. If you know what it's supposed to say, and if you have a sense of like, oh, this must be a verb, oh, I even know what the verb means, then you'll read it accurately. But you can't read it blind, right? Whereas something like ancient Greek or Italian, like if you spend an hour learning the alphabet of ancient Greek, you can now read ancient Greek as if you understand it because it's written exactly as it sounds. And the same thing is true with Hebrew with vowels, right? After you learn that alphabet with the vowels, you can read it even without knowing the language. So putting the vowels in is actually a transformative event in the history of writing because it means that you can read it without being a speaker of the language, which of course, when you think about the way we use Hebrew, right, liturgical Hebrew, that's a lot of how many Jews encounter Hebrew, right? They sort of recite it, they're reading it, pronouncing it without comprehension. That's only possible because you have that written system of vowels. So it was developed first for the biblical text, but then of course got expanded to all sorts of texts.
thank you. Joel Haber says that we do have this preservation concept of English and Hebrew in Israel because when they don't have a word for a modern thing like television, you now have Hebrew televizia. So there are many words in Hebrew that are actually English words, but written with Hebrew characters.
Right.
And
Those
now
are borrowed in.
I think people
Actually,
are, yeah.
more. I'll just give you an example. Like if college, like virtually
I was just
every
about to
well,
say
right?
that, yes.
Like Yale, whatever, right?
Yeah. So we're starting to do that. There was a question about if they didn't carve these ancient scripts in, how were they written? So you showed us the oldest letters and inscriptions. So were those carvings? Were they etchings? Were they in some kind of ink? Like what did they use, and how come it's preserved? How come we can actually still see it after 1,000 years? Or
Yeah, so there's different writing media. That's true. So it's actually one of the problems that we have because the vast majority of the writing was ink on papyrus in the Iron Age. Uh, I'm sorry, ink on parchment in the Iron Age, and then ink on papyrus. Um, but uh, but that's of course not preserved, right? The exceptions are when someone would take something like that and then bury it in a cave in the desert, right? Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, then we get it. But otherwise, that's obviously not the norm, right? Most texts do not wind up in caves in the desert. So anything that's not in a desert is going to be, organic material is just not going to last more than a century, maybe two. So we have basically nothing. So of all of the scribal work produced in Iron Age Israel, in other words, the time of the Bible, we have literally one papyrus that was preserved on the shores of the Dead Sea. That's actually, on organic material. All we have is the weird kind of writing, where someone wrote on a potsherd or someone inscribed on a stone. That's not the daily writing, right? That's extraordinary writing, but that's the only stuff that's preserved. Egypt is fortunate to all be a desert. So we have thousands and thousands of Egyptian papyri, and tens of thousands of Egyptian papyri, because virtually everywhere in Egypt, unless you literally put it into the Nile, it will be in the desert. And Mesopotamia wrote on clay, which is preserved. It's like plastic, like it'll be there forever. So those two great civilizations, we have massive amounts of textual data from, but Israel, we have very, very little exactly for that reason.
There was a question about, as we know in modern Hebrew, that we have certain letters at the end of words, they take a different form. Is that
Yeah.
something when did that evolve?
If I had time, I could actually find you a picture of it, but we can even put an
Like a
almost
chaf.
exact date on
Like,
it. Yeah. It's in the 4th century BCE. Let's see if I can find this really quickly while I talk. But the 4th century BCE. And what basically happens is that scribes, um, like all people who write, are a little bit lazy. Like, I don't mean to criticize them, but a little bit lazy. So if you think about those final letters, almost all of them, the 4 out of the 5, there are 5, but 4 out of the 5, basically the kind of the form that they take when they're not at the end of a word hooks around to the next letter. So you think about a nun, hooks to the next letter, a kaf, hooks to the next letter, a pei, hooks to the next letter. And the final form simply falls, right? So at the end of the word, the scribes simply let it drop. They just don't bother to that hook because it actually goes the other way around. What we call the final forms are actually the earlier forms. So scribes actually sort of innovate by adding that hook as they're connecting to the next letter. At the end of the word, they don't do that. So that's true for all of the letters except for the mem. The mem has its own story, but we can actually watch this in Aramaic papyri. So we can actually watch in the year 400 BCE, there's no such distinction between the middle of the word and the end of the word. But at 300 BCE, there is a distinction. So in that century, scribes start this process of distinguishing between the beginning and the middle and the end of a word. It would begin like a lot of things in scribal practice. It would begin as an ad hoc sort of a uh, informal distinction that probably one scribe started doing, then it catches on, and then it becomes part of the training, right? The key jump is when you go to scribal school, you learn that there's a distinction between the middle form and the final form. Once that happens, it's become part of the rule, not just a quirk of a scribe. So by about 300, that's already in the system.
amazing. What I love about this program is, and now everyone on the program who's in the room right now who will watch it, when they go to shul and they either read Torah or go up for an aliyah, will say that's Aramaic script. People
Oh
will be like, "What
no.
are you talking about?" But it'll be a
Gonna
great discussion
scandalize,
point at
scandalize
synagogue,
every
right?
synagogue. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
you tell them that Yeshiva University professor taught you that. In our last minute, tell us about your book that's coming out. Like, what are you going to do in that? That's novel.
I'm actually really excited. Yeah, so it's as you said, a cultural history. So it goes from the origins of the alphabet, 4,000 years ago, down to like why Turkmenistan is changing from Cyrillic to Latin script in 2024. So like all uses of the alphabet over the last 4,000 years. Not encyclopedic because it gets very boring for like whole spells of centuries, but sort of signposts along the way, like that can actually spell out like how we've used the alphabet, and then in turn how the alphabet has been a force for human cultures and identities, group marking, religious, national, all sorts of different groups over the last many centuries. So it's taken a very, very long time to put together. So I'm actually very excited that I now know it will be a book. But check back in like 2027 or so, and
Okay,
it might actually exist.
great. Well, thank you so much for this terrific program. It was worth waiting for 25 years. Hopefully we'll have you back sooner.
Oh,
What else
every
do you
25 years.
what else do you teach at YU? What will you be teaching next year? Tell us just real quickly.
So as you sort of intimated at the beginning, I'm leaving YU, not because I have anything against YU. They're not kicking me out for saying that it's Aramaic script or anything like that. But I'm taking up a professorship at Cambridge University. The title is the Regius Professor of Hebrew. Regius because the position was founded by King Henry VIII in 1540, in between beheading people. He also endowed this chair in Hebrew. Um, One of the quirks of this is that it's going to be 485 years now since the position was started. I'll be the first Jewish person to hold the position. So that's exciting. Cambridge is incredibly rich in what's physically there in Hebrew and Jewish studies. The entire Cairo Geniza is there. I don't know if you've gone on a trip there yet, but if you want to think about it, I know someone who could, make it really interesting. There's just amazing manuscripts and printed text. Isaac Newton's Hebrew Bible, which, with his annotations in the margins, are in the Trinity Library. There's amazing riches there that are connected to Hebrew throughout the generations. So I'm excited. There's tons to do there,
Terrific.
intellectually, academically, and socially. It's just a great place. So make a trip. We'll talk about that.
Well, we will definitely come visit you there. And then people are asking, do you have a name for your book that's coming out? Or is that too early?
Ooh, it's not too early. It's actually too late.
Oh,
I can't figure it out. No, no, no. It's been circulating under different names. The current name, which I hate, is Alphabet Soup, but I really,
yeah.
really don't like this name. Another possibility is the alphabetic order. I don't know. If anyone has good ideas for a book on the cultural history of the alphabet, send them my way. The
Okay.
publisher.
Well, we have a good group here. We'll get you some names.
All right, good. Yeah, I need
One
some
last
reference.
question that I forgot people ask. So we call it the alphabet, and we have the Aleph bet. Just
Hmm.
is there a reason? I mean, what's the? I mean,
So yeah, alpha just comes from the Greek. So alpha, beta.
that's
Um,
just where it comes from.
there are two letters there. But it's interesting because the rabbinic literature already talks about the Aleph Bet as a thing. Like they already use that term. I went looking because I wasn't sure how old that term was. But it's the Greeks, Hellenistic Greeks talk about the Alpha Beta, meaning the whole system of letters, and the Talmud does the same for Hebrew.
Okay. Well, thank you. Jeff Kaufman has a name for your book already. Scratchings with meaning. We'll work on it. We'll
All
get you
right, all
something.
right. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
definitely.
Thank you,
Thank you so
everybody.
all so much. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you all for joining us for this terrific program. And we hope to have you back, Professor Kohler, for more programs. Whether you're in New York or in England, doesn't matter to us. We've
Thanks.
got we've got Zoom. We can do it. Take care,
Thanks.
everybody. Keep
Bye
safe. Keep well. Where's our son? I want the son back. Send it back, please, Professor Kohler.
bye. Not so fast.
Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.